Um, Niharika Pandit is a PhD researcher working on home and everyday politics of living under military occupation in Kashmir in the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics. Niharika graduated as a Felix Scholar in MA in Gender Studies from SOAS at the University of London. Her research interests include anti-colonial, anti-militarist, feminist theory and politics. She is a member of Engenderings, an editorial collective, and an occasional writer. And her work has appeared in the Economic and Political Weekly, the Polis Project, Feminist Review, blog, Index on Censorship, First Post, Engenderings, The Hindu, among others. So before we start, I will remind everyone, please mute yourselves to minimize the noise of, to minimize the noise while the speakers are speaking. And we would love to see your lovely faces if you'd like to show your faces. But equally, if you're comfortable not showing your faces, that's perfectly fine. So I'm going to first spotlight Niharika, if I can, so that she will appear in the main. Here she is. Okay, over to you.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
First of all, many thanks to the Social Theory Center at Warwick and Dr. Goldie Osuri for inviting me here. I'm really delighted to be here and thinking together with Karsten as well as Karen and all of you. And I specifically met Karsten and Karen a few days ago. We met virtually. And also thank you everyone who's joined in. So to just begin with a few thoughts. And the times that we're living in are in many ways both strange and familiar times, where we see similar yet differential forms of socioeconomic and political inequalities, widening and making certain lives. And these lives we see are racialized, gendered, those under occupation, migrant. These are lives that are made more expendable. This indeed implies the importance of thinking through social theory. And I use both social and theory as umbrella terms that encompass various forms and traditions of thinking, including those that lie at the margins of the academy, like anti colonial and feminist thought, and how we can think through these traditions of thinking to make sense of the present and rather lengthy moment. And here I do not imply that classical theories, largely produced in the Anglophone Academy, are somehow fully translatable and applicable across contexts. And feminists and other critical race scholars have already destabilized these claims of universality and self evident nature of gender, gendering, race, and racialization. But what this present moment has shown us, yet again, is the necessity of theorizing and producing knowledge always grounded in context, letting the context drive what research questions we ask, what theoretical frameworks and concepts we use to make sense of the political phenomena in question. And as feminists have long insisted, this requires a careful thinking of our own location in the social context we engage in. And how does that embodied knowing and feeling shape the ways we engage with the world? So, implicit here is both the assumption and recalibration of research and theory making, as always grounded and situated in specific spaces and times, perhaps a process of witnessing too, especially in contexts that have been banished from the hegemonic archives and scholarship. And I'll come back to this at the end. And finally, political responsibility and commitment to the people we engage with and the contexts and political times in which knowledges and theories are produced and need to be thought differently. So I lay this out briefly to both locate my research in social theory, but also as a prelude to my intervention on the implications of doing social research during a global pandemic. Building on the feminist tradition that focuses on the seemingly ordinary processes to examine what that reveals about power and complexities of subject formation, I have been preoccupied with the concept of everyday in their important rethinking of the everyday, not as a pre-given thing or a list of things that can be recorded, recovered, and studied. Guillaume and Yisman call everyday as a mode of thinking and analysis that eludes fixity and certainty and rejects scalar thinking. In other words, this rejection of both conceptual certainty, travel of concepts across geographies and times, and their ontological givenness, that something is presumed and that is already out there and therefore can be studied without thinking through the historical and material conditions of their emergence. And this in particular becomes even more pertinent in the current moment that we inhabit, especially as these times have both challenged our ideas of what is understood as normal, but importantly, it has also exposed the absurdities and, in extension, the many forms of violence and exclusion inherent in the normal that was seemingly disturbed. So we may want to ask, who was it disturbed for? For which people was it a temporal break or a halt, as the lockdowns have been, popularly understood as? And to come back to scalar thinking, in addition to dislodging everyday from something that is out there and can be studied based on our presumptions, determining what everyday is and comprises, the turn to everyday as a way of thinking has also shaped our understanding of the transnational, global, national, local, and the body as always co-constitutive. That is, these spatial processes continuously make, cross, and possibly subvert one another and remain in flux. And the implications of this lack of fixity are manifold. So it helps centering the banal and understudied objects of research, for example, the functions of war language and militarized metaphors to describe the pandemic, and what are the material effects and their rootedness in militarism that makes war thinking and tactics seem normal and palatable. And it also explains the multiple intersecting and contradictory social processes. And these processes are gendered, racialized, classed, that make both power and perhaps political transformation too possible. And here I'm thinking of how pandemic is war narrative suggests that what existed before and what we were living before were as if times of peace. And just to focus on the everyday and systemic violence and oppression. And we've seen the Black Lives Matter mobilization after the murder of George Floyd, continuing street and online protests against political oppression in India, or strikes by medical workers and their systematic precarity in many parts of the world. And all of these instances expose the inconsistency of the claims of normalcy. The questions that demand repeated asking then are, who are deemed as essential yet dispensable? Who are these corona warriors who will be the first to die in the line of duty? And almost certainly, it is the poor, migrant, racialized, and gendered body. So I spent most of this pandemic year doing fieldwork in two geographies, Kashmir Valley and India. Certainly what constitutes as field and fieldwork is increasingly being reconsidered now, especially when bodily proximity may be harmful in contexts already gripped with precarity and uncertainty. But that's a whole other discussion, perhaps to have in the near future too. So I was in these spaces in very specific temporal moments, moments that are not isolated, but need to be historicized. So India saw nationwide and transnational solidarity demonstrations against discriminatory citizenship laws. A lot of protests that happened transnationally, but also mainly in India, were led by Muslim women like Shaheen Bagh in Delhi, right before the virus halted these. And India has been in the throes of fascism led by a right-wing government for years now. And in Kashmir, Kashmir was reeling and continues to reel as I speak from the devastating psychic and material effects of the renewed 2019 siege in August. Sorry, there was.
Yeah, sorry, I think someone hadn't muted, so I muted.
Okay, sorry. So I'll continue. And Kashmir, so Kashmir was reeling, continues to reel as I speak from the devastating psychic and material effects of the renewed 2019 August siege that many Kashmiris understand as the day of complete annexation of their homeland and nation. Military occupation has always been there in differential forms, yet many of my interlocutors that I spoke to variously termed this siege as a jolt, existential threat, moment of disbelief, anxiety, shock, illegal, hopeless, and unreal. And the exceptionality, but also continuity in this moment. And these two things can be understood as coexisting opposition based on feeling and knowing in the overarching project of military occupation has been understood as far more threatening than the virus and the so-called war-like pandemic. These two geographies are also deeply intertwined in a colonial relation, with Kashmir being a territory that the Indian state and the majority of Indian people also believe that needs to be occupied, possessed, contained, and forcibly integrated without consent and popular will. So the masculinist and gendered logics of this renewed military siege as by a post-colony, and I use quotation marks for post-colony here, are not definitely lost in such claims. So when the state says pandemic is a war or a warlike situation, and all citizens, despite the ever increasing caste, class, gender inequalities, are soldiers and warriors, what are the implications of these claims? What form of inequalities and oppressions are reinforced, flattened, and tactically erased from political discourses and memory? And what in turn are the repercussions of shedding political responsibility by those that the state appeals to towards occupied communities and all others whose oppression we remain complicit in? So pandemic as war narrative implies that there is an exceptional situation. An earlier analysis of COVID variously made this insufficient claim. Indeed, the situation and the way virus cases rose across the world was alarming, making this a public health emergency. But what gets erased in pointing only this particular moment as urgent and exceptional? Within India, sudden lockdowns led to migrant and economic crisis, with many avoidable deaths of poor migrants due to fatigue and hunger who were forced to walk to their villages. But as this is a war, implicit in this understanding is that there will be casualties. Yet questions were seldom asked about who, which people were dying. Rather, banging pots and pans and lighting candles was understood as an adequate show of gratitude to essential workers. It was in the middle of the seemingly warlike pandemic and deliberately on August 5, marking a year of the Kashmir siege, that the foundation stone of a politically contentious temple in north of India was laid. A warlike pandemic did not stop, rather facilitated the surge of Hindu nationalism, when neither street protests nor dissenting was always possible or safe. Many of my friends and I, who after a decade were living in our birth towns in deeply right-wing belts of the country, could viscerally feel the fear of backlash of the housing societies we were in if we didn't do or resisted what was told. Clearly, the warlike emergency had mobilized nationalist fervor that was on unanimous display on August 5. In Kashmir, this exceptionality is not certainly virus-led, but has been a lived reality for decades now. It is telling how many of the interlocutors I spoke to remembered August 5 last year as solidifying a sense of liminality and uncertainty and of heightened personal and collective anxieties. In contrast to popular narratives, the pandemic for many of them was just another lockdown within a lockdown. A lockdown finally to save us from dying, a friend joked. More specifically, a militaristic lockdown with more blockades, concertina wires overspilling on roads, and semi-permanent blockading of red zones, which were virus red zones. So what the sense of warlike emergency within India did was strengthen the interlinks between nationalism and militarism to further the occupation in Kashmir, where state actions were seen justifiable and largely went unquestioned. So there were no questions asked, and hardly any social media outrage even. So for instance, even after the pandemic, the occupation tactics remained similar, but certainly quickened and heightened. Added to gunfights, destructions of home, police repression, now was the state legitimizing and expanding settler colonialism, changing domicile laws, transferring land, and issuing mining contracts. So while nationalist and securitization logics have always been enough to mobilizing support in India for suspending Kashmiri people's rights and freedom, the pandemic as war narrative only created germane conditions for occupation to flourish even further and be legitimized within the occupying state. So, in unpacking the pandemic and militaristic rhetoric that was mobilized in the aftermath, I'm not suggesting that somehow this moment and the virus constituted something exceptional in non conflict, non occupied zones as opposed to occupied zones. Instead, what I'm trying to suggest is the exceptionality rhetoric was mobilized to different ends to continually consolidate Hindutva and authoritarianism through political repression while facilitating settler colonialism in an occupied zone. And also, there is no simple causal link between what everyday discourses of militarism do and how they co constitute the political. Rather, what remains really pertinent is to understand the granular, complex, as well as co constitutive links of militarism with processes of nationalism and the violence that remains implicit in such nationalistic imaginaries. And they are inherently exclusionary and also very Brahmanical if you look at the context of India, and how this matrix gets mobilized in particular spaces and times. And we have the pandemic as an example. So, finally, to come back to the question of political commitment, and this is the question that remains both crucial to anti-colonial feminist theory as well as praxis and their objects of research and the ways they do research. And as part of critically engaging and being reflexive includes thinking through our own social location, the what, how, and why of research we choose to do. And that can be an attempt to interrogate our own complicities as well as expose the silences both in popular discourses but also in academic scholarship. And I'm reminded of feminist scholar Claire Hemmings here, who calls this form of knowing and unlearning as affective dissonance that can give rise to a form of affective solidarity. So such solidarity is this feeling of discomfort that is non-essentialist or attached to a pre-given identity group. And I reckon that here lies the potentiality for political transformation that understands life and living as always relational and intersubjective. Thank you.